In the 1890s, though, led by Josephus Daniels, who owned the News and Observer, and other extreme right leaders who wanted to restore total subjugation of black people, they began a vicious campaign. In 1896, 60 years before Brown, the Supreme Court ruled that Jim Crow segregation was constitutional, turning loose the running dogs of racism all across the South, setting up the stage for a terrorist attack on African Americans and their black and white fusion partners that happened on November 10, 1898, when 3 to 5% of women in the city was killed. In order to stop progressive movement, in order to stop diversity, the white supremacy counter-revolution brought intense pressure on white people not to associate with their black neighbors. In 1898, after having stepped forward in 1868, in 1898, North Carolina stepped back. Legalized segregation was recreated in housing, churches, schools, jobs, trade unions, and credit. Black voters were disenfranchised, and the sight of black politicians walking the streets of Raleigh, which had begun in 1868 and beyond, was gone. And the white terrorist attack on Wilmington was replicated across the South. And then in 1909, Springfield, Illinois, where President Lincoln and Obama began their political careers, the NAACP was born, and immediately began a fresh march toward freedom. Let me teach for a moment. From 1900 to 1930, black educators were in short on the defensive. Professor Charles Hunter, one of their leaders, began publishing the Oberlin School Record for the concentration of black families living near Oberlin Road, preaching the habits of industry and thrift, kind of like Booker T. Washington. From 1931 to 1953, thanks to gains being made by the NAACP in national court cases, blacks began to raise more openly the demands for equal teacher salaries and equal teacher training and more money for black colleges, trying to work with this thing called separate but equal. Then, according to Wilma Cecilia Peoples, in her dissertation, School Desegregation in Raleigh, 1954, 1964, May 17th came, 1954. But instead of accepting the law, Governor Luther Hodges set up what was called the Pearsall Committee. Hodges argued that the mixing of the races in the public schools cannot be accomplished and should not be attempted. The state came up with four corners defense to slow down obeying the law, obeying what the ruling of 1954 said. 8 black parents with the NAACP's assistant tried to send their children to all-white schools in Raleigh in 1955. But the paper published their names and addresses in the paper, and they were subjected to steady harassment. Their requests were denied. Governor Hodges, instead of standing with the Constitution and these courageous people, said blacks and whites should all endorse voluntary segregation. In addition to the scam of freedom of choice, see, that's just the new language. Yep. Voluntary segregation is what Hodges said. Freedom of choice. The Pearsall Committee attacked the NAACP, bro, you know this history. Attacked the NAACP and compared us with the KKK. Said we were the extremists when we were arguing for the upholding of the law, while others were violently trying to fight the law. And they said back then that North Carolina should change its constitution, listen, to argue for vouchers, private schools, and give local school boards the right to close school systems rather than integrate them. That's the issue. Black church leaders and black educators, some white faculty at UNC and Duke, some white ministers organizing under the umbrella of the North Carolina Council of Churches, and some white activists and teachers all opposed the Pearsall plan. But the Senate voted 49-0 to support the Pearsall plan. The House was 106-2. Wake County's legislative delegation favored the Pearsall plan. Wake County, they favored it. Representative William Brantley people of goodwill who supported the Constitution were hard at work. The Raleigh Council on Preparation for Integration was organized in 1954 by black and white parents to plan Raleigh's response to the Supreme Court decision. The group published a newsletter called the Monthly Interrogator. And by 1959 had evolved into the Raleigh Council on Education and later the Raleigh Council on Human Relations. Several white ministers, including Dr. Poteet, Pullen Baptist, and Reverend Norris of the United Church, made the Christian case for integration. Raleigh's politicians, however, caved in, realizing there were a lot of black citizens affected, but they could not vote. Mayor Fred Wheeler appointed a committee to study Brown's application for Raleigh in 1955, but then caved in to the Pearsall Plan in 1956. Black attorney Fred Collins was first appointed to the board in 49. He chaired the Wake County Committee on Negro Affairs. White board members caucused to decide whether they should eat with him, according to Dr. Peoples' dissertation, because they always ate together before the meeting to make their decision, and there was no open meetings law then. After some discussion, the people who ran the schools of Wake County finally decided to let the black lawyer eat with them. School Superintendent Jesse O. Sanderson led the segregationist forces in Raleigh. He came up with devious schemes to discourage black parents from trying to transfer their kids into all-white schools. In 1957, when a black family, the Joe Hope family, sued the Raleigh School Board, represented by Thomas F. Ellis, successfully argued that the Hope family had no case because they did not appear in person to ask for the transfer. The first African-American, William Bill Campbell, was admitted to Murphy School in 1960 after the Campbells complied with every little requirement. Ralph Campbell was the Wake County NAACP President. Two of his siblings, Mildred and Ralph, were turned down by the same board. 400 white Murphy parents signed a petition opposing desegregation as not in the best interest of white children. In 1963, only 37 of 69 requests for transfers were approved, 9 years after Brown. I want us to understand, it was not as though May 17, 1954 happened and on May 18, everybody started working together. It was actually on May 17th, the Supreme Court ruled, and the segregationists and resegregationists went to work to undo it on May 18th.